on Jerusalem Dateline. This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the U.S. and Russia face off in Moscow over Syria.
So President Trump is right to have actually enforced a red line that Obama never enforced.
Plus, Egypt's Christians recover after 2 major terror attacks.
They have said, we are willing to suffer for Jesus' sake.
While Jews celebrate the Passover, Christians celebrate the resurrection of Jesus at Easter. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you this week from the Garden Tomb, where many people believe Jesus Christ rose from the dead here 2,000 years ago. We'll talk more about the resurrection later in the show, but first in the news, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson went to Moscow as part of the latest crisis in the relationship between Russia and the United States. Dale Hurd has that story.
Right now, we're not getting along with Russia at all.
It wasn't supposed to be like this. U.S.-Russia relations were supposed to improve under the Trump administration. But the Syrian nerve gas attack blamed on Russia's ally Bashar al-Assad and the U.S. missile attack against Syria has caused U.S.-Russia ties to hit bottom.
The current state of U.S.-Russia relations is at a low point.
Russian President Vladimir Putin also said on Russian TV that the level of trust has deteriorated. This after Secretary of State Rex Tillerson faced an unusually hostile reception in Moscow. The U.S. missile strike on Syria that triggered the diplomatic crisis hit a Syrian airbase where there had been Russian military personnel. So did Moscow know about the chemical weapons?
I would like to think that they didn't know, but certainly they could have. They were there, so we'll find out.
After a tense 2-hour closed-door meeting with Putin, Tillerson then angered Russia by bluntly calling for regime change in Damascus.
Our view is that the reign of the Assad family is coming to an end.
But Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, referring to Iraq, said experiments like that, which are built on an obsession with overthrowing dictators, totalitarian or authoritarian leaders, we have already seen. We know the ending of it way too well. The two sides also agreed to disagree about Ukraine, where Moscow backs rebel forces. With relations between the two nuclear powers worsening, Google Trends reports internet searches for the term World War III have hit an all-time high.
The world's 2 foremost nuclear powers cannot have this kind of relationship.
And the U.S. warned Russia that it is only isolating itself with its continued support of Assad. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
We talk more about the crisis between the United States and Russia back in our studio with Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg. Joel, what's your reaction to what's happening now after the Trump administration struck that Syrian airbase?
Well, I don't think Vladimir Putin could have imagined when Rex Tillerson became Secretary of State that the first conversation they might have, or his government might have, would be such a contentious one. Right. Putin gave Tillerson the Order of Friendship, the highest civilian award you can give him, because he did so many oil and gas deals with Russia. But I think what's interesting is that you have President Trump having chosen Tillerson, and this may prove that this was a wise choice. I was skeptical, but if you have somebody who knows the leadership, knows Putin particularly, and can say, listen, we want to work with you, but you can't be supporting people who are using weapons of mass destruction against anyone, much less their own children. That's a good message to send, an important message to send. I think most of the world has reacted positively to President Trump's order to strike, and rightly so. Not in 8 years did the Obama administration ever create a cost to the Assad regime for all kinds of atrocities. It was right that President Trump did so, and it's wrong for the Russians to side with Assad. I hope we see the Russians move to remove Assad.
A lot of people have said this is a market change, obviously, from the Obama administration. Some people have said there's a new sheriff in town. What new signal does this send to Russia, Iran, and other enemies of the U.S. in the region?
It could. I mean, it does so in the sense, it sends a new signal in the sense that, you know, the Obama administration never used military force even while promising it, which, of course, when the president abandoned his own red line threat warning to Assad, it absolutely cratered American credibility in the Middle East and worldwide. So President Trump is right to have actually enforced a red line that Obama never enforced. President Trump exposed the lie of the Putin administration that said that all of the chemical weapons had been removed from Syria. Clearly that wasn't true. The question now is whether the Trump administration develops an actual strategy. What are its goals? We've heard they want to remove Assad. We've heard that they're not going to remove Assad. We've heard that we're not going into Syria, but we're already there. We've got 1,000 special forces on the ground. So they've got to make some determinations. I think in the short term, Trump is right to be cautious, not to try to own Syria. Syria's a disaster. It's imploding. We can't fix it. But we can have some objectives. One, you can't use weapons of mass destruction without punishment. Two, that we are going to take out the Syrian Air Force, that we are going to create safe zones for Syrians to come and have air cover and humanitarian relief. These would be some initial objectives, but you also have to have an objective of protecting Israel and Jordan from retaliation by the Assad regime. And you've got to have an objective that Iran can't end up the owner of Syria. This would be a horrible conclusion to this civil war. Are those doable? It depends on how serious Trump is. So he's made a first good step, but we've got to see what are his actual goals and how will he seek to achieve them.
In other news in the Middle East, the victims of the Palm Sunday bombings in Egypt were laid to rest. In 2 separate attacks, ISIS killed nearly 50 and wounded well over 100. We discuss how Egyptian Christians are dealing with this latest attack, as well as centuries of persecution, with Dick Brogdon, a Christian leader in Cairo. This is not anything new to the Christian community. In what way are they responding biblically?
You know, the Egyptian church is marvelous in the sense that there has been a long history of oppression, even for 14 centuries beyond that, all the time back in Diocletian. So for 2 millennia, the church in Egypt has suffered. And what is remarkable and biblical about the Egyptian church response is that they have not responded in anger or by taking up weapons. In fact, from the top leadership in the Coptic church all the way down to laity, they have turned the other cheek. They have exhibited the spirit of Jesus. They have said, we are willing to suffer for Jesus' sake. So even though it's been difficult, we just laud our brothers and sisters here in this land at the dignity and the patience and the grace that they have exhibited during their times of suffering.
And Dick, how can people be praying, Christians around the world be praying for the church there in Egypt now?
Would you pray that the church in Egypt would not only survive these militant attacks, but have grace and favor and courage to articulate and open up their mouths and share with Muslims across the nation the reason for the hope that we have? You see, in these tragedies, which are horrific, we are not dismayed because we are people who believe in resurrection. We're believing that in the end, God makes all things right. Ultimately, that will be when Jesus returns. But in the meantime, would you pray that the Egyptian church would not just absorb these difficulties, but be proactive in proclaiming to Muslims the reason for the hope that they have, that in Jesus all things are made right.
Up next, how important is the resurrection to the Christian faith? Behind me is the tomb where many people believe Jesus Christ was laid to rest and then 3 days later rose from the dead. And as Paul Strand reports, it's the resurrection that is the core of the Christian faith.
To believe the events around that first Easter, you pretty much have to believe that Jesus did indeed exist and that the New Testament can be trusted. Biblical scholar Jonathan Marrow.
The fact is, we have far more sources for Jesus of Nazareth than we do for many historical figures in the first century. Is what we have at least 18. 12 of those are non-Christian sources.
As for the New Testament,
these books are the best attested pieces of ancient literature we possess.
Dallas Theological Seminary's Darrell Bach says the Bible has far more ancient pages surviving than any other book from antiquity.
It's exceptional. You're talking about over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, over 8,000 Latin manuscripts. Most books that we work with in the ancient world have maybe at best a dozen manuscripts.
For some, the biggest barrier to faith is believing that Jesus Christ could really have risen from the dead.
But Merrow says everything hangs on that.
Paul made the argument in 1 Corinthians 15, he's like, look, you can test this. If the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity is false. It's whether you believe it or not, whether you're sincere about it, if the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity is false, go to the next religion.
But Christian experts say that to dismiss the resurrection, any theory you come up with to explain the historical happenings has to explain 3 historical facts. That there was an empty tomb 3 days after Jesus' body had been placed in it. He appeared to hundreds of people in numerous places for almost 7 weeks after his crucifixion. And something huge happened to turn all the cowering, cowardly disciples into bold believers, proclaiming a risen Messiah they were willing to be tortured and die for.
Some suggest that the apostles all lied, a vast conspiracy theory to turn the deficit of his death into the positive of a risen Lord. But apologists like Darrell Bach here in Dallas point out that when you look at it all the way through, it's actually easier to believe in the resurrection than its alternatives.
Some suggest the female disciples who first found the empty tomb might have just had the wrong tomb. But surely the Jewish leaders who'd had Roman guards placed by Jesus' burial place, and Joseph of Arimathea, who owned the tomb where Jesus was, would have quickly corrected that mistake.
If you're going around preaching Jesus was physically raised from the dead and people knew where he was buried and knew where they could find his bones, that message wouldn't even get off the ground.
A leading biblical apologist, Josh McDowell, says these disciples knew this.
In the resurrection, where was the hardest place in the world to convince anyone it was true if it was false? Jerusalem, where a 15-minute walk by anyone could confirm the emptiness of the tomb. And then they said, you were there, you saw it.
Matthew 28 points out the Jewish leaders bribed the tomb's guards to say that they'd fallen asleep, and the disciples then stole Jesus' body. But if they were asleep, how would they know it was the disciples? And if the disciples were making up Jesus' resurrection, would they have lived and died for him, and a fiction they themselves made up?
And if they knew it, then you'd have to say, here were these men who not only died for a lie, but they knew it was a lie. I challenge you to find others in history that is true of. It's not.
You don't die knowingly for something that you know you made up. You would back off, and that didn't happen either.
These and other experts say that in truth, it takes something as radical as Jesus' resurrection to so completely transform cowardly Peter, who was so scared just before the crucifixion, he swore he didn't even know Jesus.
And then you see Peter with this radical transformation going from coward to this courageous champion who's saying, look, here I stand, this is what I'm saying, this is what's true.
Merrow points out Jesus' brother James was also instantly changed.
James, the brother of Jesus, didn't follow Jesus during his earthly ministry. He thought he was crazy.
James despised his brother, thought he was embarrassing the family, everything. And then Jesus appeared to him in James' own word, and he became the leader of the church of Jerusalem.
And then after the fact, James becomes an early leader in the church and was persecuted and eventually killed for that belief.
And apologists say it could only be a resurrected Jesus showing up 2 or 3 years later that could transform the church's worst persecutor into its main missionary.
Saul of Tarsus was anything but a follower of believing Jesus. He went from city to city, casting his vote to have him imprisoned and executed. But in his own words, Christ appeared to him.
So the main thing is just explaining, how someone like a Saul who becomes Paul even exists.
He was holding the coat when people were killing the first Christians. He was adamantly opposed to this movement, and then he became a Christian. What accounts for that?
The greatest murders into one of the greatest missionaries, to a Christian hater, to a Christian lover. Something happened in Paul's life that I've never found any other explanation that it even comes close to satisfying me intellectually except, and Jesus appeared to Paul after the resurrection.
The first century Jews believed women were second-class citizens. So if the disciples were lying about the resurrection, they made their story all the harder to accept by putting women at the forefront.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all recount Jesus' earliest women followers finding the empty tomb. Now that in the first century, where a woman's testimony would have been about the level of just above a slave, that would not be your best foot forward.
You never make up a story that way. This is what's called the criterion of embarrassment in historical Jesus studies, that you never make up the story this way. So the reason the story is this way is because it must be grounded in what happened.
Saying the disciples lied about Jesus' resurrection doesn't explain his appearance before 500 people. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 suggested doubters go talk to them.
You've got living history. You've got the people who were there to cross-check whatever message is being there. So it's not as though that these things could have been invented and no one would have challenged it. You've got this idea that there's witnesses, go investigate them. It has all the ring of truth and not the ring of that conspiracy theory where they just made this thing up to invent their own religion.
A lot of people then say, well, the appearances of Jesus were hallucinations. 500 people one time.
McDowell studied the research on hallucinations, which shows they're not triggered by anything external, so no two people ever have the same hallucination.
Because it's all internal, subjective. Would it have 500 people have the same hallucination? Paul would be 500 miracles equal to the resurrection.
But Merrow does say to accept the resurrection, you do have to believe in God.
But if it's at least possible that God exists, then miracles become possible. And when you look at the resurrection evidence, it's pretty remarkable how strong it is. And that's why it's at the core of Christianity. But it's not a blind faith kind of thing like believing in the Easter Bunny or a lucky rabbit's foot. Christians don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible says so. They believe he rose from the dead because that's what the earliest and best historical documents show, and that's what's the best explanation of the data.
Paul Strand, CBN News.
Up next, see the place where Pilate may have sentenced Jesus to death. It's a busy week in Jerusalem where people celebrating both Passover and Holy Week. We want to take you inside the walls of the old city to Herod's Palace, a place where there's over 2,000 years of recorded history, and a place where some believe Pontius Pilate sentenced Jesus to death.
At the western edge of the old city, the Tower of David stands above the walls. 16 years ago, archaeologists found a building while working on the Tower of David Museum. Records on its walls go back even before the time of Jesus and the Roman governor who sentenced him to the cross, Pontius Pilate. For years, experts suggested that Pilate handed down his death sentence from Antonia's fortress on the other side of the city, where the Roman soldiers were housed. But recent evidence uncovered here at the site of King Herod's palace indicates that the luxury-loving Pilate was more likely to have pronounced judgment here. Archaeologist Amit Re'em helped discover the palace site in 1999. He's familiar with the history on these walls, from Herod's time until the British put a prison on it in the 1940s.
Until now, those impressive walls are the only remains from Herod's Palace. We do not know what happened to the superstructures, to the palace itself. Maybe it was destroyed in the big revolt. Maybe it was destroyed by the Romans. Maybe it was destroyed by the Crusaders or the Ottomans.
We don't know exactly where Jesus was tried, where he had his interview before Pontius Pilate, but we know it's somewhere in Herod's palace.
David Pileggi is pastor of Christ Church, just steps away from the site.
We know that the palace of Herod the Great eventually became Roman property after Herod's death, and that every year Pontius Pilate would come from Caesarea to Jerusalem here during the time of Passover to oversee the security of the city during the festival that the Jews called the Feast of Freedom. And it was at this time where if there was going to be trouble in Jerusalem, it would be during the Passover holiday.
Pileggi says that in a way, the Tower of David encompasses the entire life story of Jesus.
Scholars had been saying for half a century that the life of Jesus begins at the Tower of David, or what was then Herod's palace. That's when the Magi come to visit King Herod, and his life ends basically when Pontius Pilate sentences him to death, pretty much in the same location. So there's some very interesting irony in this story.
Israeli archaeologist Renee Sivan is still struck by its power and opulence, even though she helped begin the digging.
Jerusalem is like an onion. You peel it, and it never ends. But then you cry a bit, but not not too much. That is what happens here.
Pelegi calls the Tower of David the best museum in the city and says tourists would do well to start their journey here.
Now we have the extra bonus of having the very place where Jesus was sent to execution by Pontius Pilate, and this will help Christians better visualize those monumentous events that happened to Jesus the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, in the last week of his life.
And just a couple of miles away, the Mount of Olives, where Scripture says he'll come again. John Wagi, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, how did Jesus celebrate the Passover? Find out when we come back. Here's an example of what we do on one of our social media platforms. This is called Hebrew Word Wednesday, and this week we're celebrating Passover.
We are in the season of Passover, beginning with a Passover Seder. In Luke chapter 22, verse 7, Jesus tells his disciples, he says, "Go and prepare the Passover." In verse 15, he says, "I've earnestly desired to keep this Passover with you." He earnestly desired to keep the festival of Pesach and have a Seder with his disciples, even at the very cusp of his going into his persecutions and ultimately his death. And he tells us that one day in the Messianic kingdom, that we will come sit at his table and we will dine with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we will listen to our master share and to teach and to inform us as his people about the ways of his kingdom.
Well, that's it for this edition. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. Thanks for joining us this week from the Garden Tomb. To all our Jewish friends, Chag Sameach and Happy Passover. To all our Christian friends, Happy Resurrection Day. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.